Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you again. Can somebody just give me a thumbs up in the chat to let me know that you can see and hear me okay? Brilliant. Thank you, Neil. And you, Tony. And you, Rach. And you, Paul. Oh, good to see you all again. I want to start today with a question. If you were to disappear from your business for the next month, what would stop? What decisions won't get made? What problems would sit there waiting for you to get back? What customers would need you? What would your team be unable to move forward on? And my reason for asking that is because one of the biggest frustrations I hear from people running established businesses is that I delegate tasks, but somehow they always end up coming back to me. And why that happens is what we're going to explore today, because often the problem isn't people are unwilling to take responsibility. The problem is that what you sometimes call delegation is not really delegation at all. You hand over the task, but you keep the judgment calls, you keep the authority, you keep the decision making, you keep the risk. And then the first time something unusual happens, the task lands back on your desk. So today, I want to look at why that happens and how you can change it. Because if everything comes back to you, then sooner or later, you're going to become the biggest bottleneck in your own business. So let's start with one of the biggest misunderstandings about delegation. A task moving to someone else doesn't necessarily mean responsibilities move with it. Put your teeth in, Kev. Imagine for a second you were to say to somebody, I want you to deal with all the new inquiries that are coming through the website. I want you to deal with all the new inquiries that are coming through the website. Now, that might sound like delegation, but then you were to add things like, before you respond, make sure you check in with me. If prospects ask about price, speak to me. If they want anything unusual, come back to me. If they sound like a good prospect, let me know and I'll take over. If you're not sure about anything, just ask me. What have you really delegated? Very little, I suggest. In actual fact, the activity's moved, but the ownership hasn't. And that's why everything keeps coming back to you. The moment judgment is required, the former owner of the task, which might be you, is involved again. And that means that real delegation isn't simply about transferring work. It's about developing someone else's ability to own an outcome. And that's a very different thing. So is something useful, a useful test for you, actually. Think about the last 7 days in your business. How many times did someone ask you a question that they could quite probably have answered themselves? How many decisions waited for you to make them? How many tasks did you check before they could move forward? How many times did somebody start doing something and then handed it back to you when things became slightly complicated? How many problems landed on your desk simply because you're the easiest person to ask? Now, all those things are clues, but often it's easy just to blame the individual. They don't take responsibility. They won't make decisions. They always come to me. But more often than not, as leaders, we have to take a long, hard look in the mirror, because we might have trained people to behave that way. They ask, we answer. They ask again, we answer again. And then eventually everybody in the business learns that when you're in doubt, ask the leader. And what I found is the more capable you are, the easier it is for you to fall into that trap, because giving the answer feels quicker than coaching somebody to think. Taking the task back feels quicker than showing someone else how to handle it. Making the decision feels easier than allowing somebody else to make it. Now, in the short term, it probably is quicker, but you're going to pay for that speed later on because you remain the answer to absolutely everything. At the other extreme, we have what's known as abdication. So that sounds more like you deal with it. You go deal with it without any context. You've got no clear outcome, no standards, no boundaries, no authorities, no measures in place, no support. And then the leader is surprised when the result is not what they wanted or not what they expected. But that's not delegation either. For me, delegation sits between those two extremes. At one end, you've got control. I need to approve everything. And at the other end, you've got abdication. You sort it out. But proper delegation is, here's the outcome we need. Here's why it matters. Here's what good looks like. Here's what you can decide. Here's where I need to be involved. And here's how we're going to know while it's working. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that's a completely different process. So let me give you a practical example. Let's stick with the example we mentioned earlier on. Let's say you've got a leader in a business who's currently handling every initial call after someone completes an inquiry form on the company website. So an inquiry comes in, the leader picks it up, the leader makes that first call, the leader qualifies the prospect, the leader answers the initial questions. Now, let's say, for instance, that making those calls takes the leader up to 10 hours a week. And the first reaction might be, well, I'm the best person to have that conversation. And you might well be. But here's the question. Do you need to remain to be the best person? Or would it be possible for you to train somebody else to become good enough? Because if that person could take genuine ownership of that first stage, it means that the leader can potentially release 10 hours every week. And then think about those 10 hours. It's not 10 hours to do nothing. It could be 10 hours to work on high investment, high impact activities within the business. So you're investing that time back into the business. So for instance, you could be developing the team. You could be improving the margins. You might be building better relationships. You might be working on strategy. You might be improving the systems in the business. You might be having some really important conversations. Effectively, you're creating the future of the business. So how could you go about delegating the initial inquiry call properly? Well, it's definitely not by saying you take the inquiry calls for Monday. That's just task transfer. And instead, what you need is a solid, tried and tested process that works. So for instance, step one would be to identify the right things to delegate. You do that by asking yourself, should this task still be done by me? Now, that sounds obvious, doesn't it? But many people never ask it. They just keep doing things because they've always done them, because they're good at them, because they're important, or simply because they've never stopped to ask the question, why am I still doing this? Now, I found that a really useful rule to have in mind is that important doesn't automatically mean leader only, because something can be really important but still be done extremely well by someone else. So ask yourself, is this genuinely work that only I can do? If not, then it's worth examining. Step two is to choose the right person. So the question isn't simply who's got some spare time, it's who could become capable of owning this task. And that's a very different standard, because now you've got to consider things like, does the person have the right communication skills? Do they understand the business? Do they understand the customer? Can they learn the commercial judgment that's needed for this task? Do they have the confidence to make decisions? And importantly, really importantly, are you prepared to invest the time in developing them? Because delegation often fails when we choose someone based on availability rather than suitability. Step 3 is define the outcome. And this is where many delegation conversations often go wrong. So you describe the task, but you don't describe the result. So for the inquiry call example, the task is to form new inquiries. But what's the outcome that's needed? Now, perhaps the outcome is every new inquiry is contacted within 2 working hours. It could be the prospect feels listened and understood, or you establish whether they're a good fit for our business. You identify their main need. You gather the information required for them to move to the next stage of the process. Or the right prospects are moved forward to the appropriate person. It could be all of those outcomes. But now you've got something much, much clearer. And you're no longer simply delegating an activity, you're defining an outcome. Step 4 is to explain why it matters. Now, this step is often skipped, but here's the thing. People perform better when they understand why something matters. So, why is that initial inquiry call important? Well, it's important because it's the first human experience that somebody might have with our company, and speed of response matters. Or it matters because asking the right questions protects the team from wasted time on poor fit opportunities. Or it matters because a great first conversation builds trust. Or it matters because the quality of qualification affects conversion later. What you'll find is that when somebody understands where they're no longer simply following instructions, that they begin to understand the thinking behind the work. And that matters if you want them to start making good decisions. Step 5 is to agree the standards. We need to define what good looks like. How quickly should that call happen? What questions need to be asked? What information must be recorded? What tone needs to be used? What makes someone a good prospect? What should never be promised? What happens at the end of the call? Think about it. What would need to happen in that call so that you'd be saying, that's exactly how I want it handled? Because if those standards aren't clear, you're going to leave people guessing. And when they guess, they might guess differently from you. And you might jump into, or you might jump to the conclusion that they're not capable, but more often than not, it's they simply didn't know what good looked like. Step 6 is to give authority, not just responsibility. And this is a huge one because responsibility without authority just creates frustration. If you tell someone you own this, but every decision still requires your permission, they don't really own it, do they? So you need to define the decision boundaries. What can they decide without asking? What can they offer? What can they change? What can they promise? What must they involve you or someone else in? For example, that could be, you can arrange the next meeting without asking me. You can answer these pricing questions. You can decline inquiries that clearly fall outside these criteria. If the opportunity is above a certain value, then involve me. If they ask for something that's outside our normal terms, then involve the operations director. Now the person knows where their authority starts and where their authority ends. And that creates confidence. Step 7 is to agree checkpoints instead of you constantly checking everything, because this is another place where leaders accidentally take responsibility back. They delegate something and then they micromanage it. Have you done it? What did the prospect say? What did you tell them? Did you remember to ask this? Send me the notes. But that doesn't feel like ownership to the person, does it? It feels a lot like supervision. So agree the checkpoints in advance. So that could be, let me think, that could be the first 2 weeks. We're going to review 3 of your calls every day together. then it might be one day the next week, and then it might be only by exception. Because the goal isn't to remove accountability, the goal is to remove dependency. There's a big difference between the two. And step 8 is to review, learn, and increase responsibility. Delegation isn't a one-off event, it's a development process. So after a period of time, sit down with the person that you've delegated to and ask them what's working for you. What are you, or where are you finding any difficulties? What questions keep coming up that you're not sure of the answer? Where might you still need information? What decisions do you feel you're now confident to make yourself? What can I step away from next? And that final question is really important because good delegation should gradually reduce the leader's involvement. And if in 6 months' time you're still answering the same questions you were answering in week 1, then something's gone really wrong, which means you haven't followed the 8-step process. Now, you might ask what happens when the first exception appears. And this is where the real test comes in, because normal situations are pretty easy to document. The challenge is when there is an exception, that unusual customer, that unexpected complaint, that different pricing question, the situation that nobody predicted. And when that happens, many leaders immediately jump in and take the task back. They say, leave it to me, I'll sort it. I knew this would happen, but it's useful to realize that every exception is also a development opportunity. So instead of immediately giving the answer, ask, what do you think we should do here? What options do you see? What are the risks? What would you recommend we do now? And that's how the new task owner's judgment gets developed. And if you keep answering every difficult question, people become better at asking. But if you teach them how to think through difficult situations, they become better at making decisions. And that's the goal, isn't it? I think it's worth emphasizing, by the way, that I often hear leaders say, my team needs to take more responsibility. But here's the thing. You can't just demand responsibility. It needs to be made possible. People need context. They need clarity. They need authority. They need boundaries. They need the information. They need feedback. And sometimes they need permission to make a mistake without being punished for it. Because if the first time someone makes a decision differently from you, you immediately take the responsibility back, they learn a very simple lesson. Don't decide, ask. And then you wonder why nobody takes ownership. And the truth is that you have to create the conditions in which ownership can grow. And this is why delegation is much bigger than just time management. It's leadership. You're not simply taking things off your plate. You're building the capability of the people around you. You're teaching them how the business thinks, how decisions get made, what matters, what good looks like, how to deal with uncertainty. And gradually, the business becomes less dependent on one person, you. And when that starts, and when delegation starts creating real leverage for you, not because a fewer things are on your to-do list, but because more people are capable of producing good outcomes without needing your constant involvement. Okay, here's your momentum move for today. Look back over the last week and identify one responsibility that repeatedly came back to you. Not necessarily the biggest thing, just one that keeps returning. And now ask, what would somebody need for me to genuinely, or for them to genuinely own this outcome? What would somebody need from me to genuinely own this outcome? Do they need clearer standards? Do they need more context, better training, more authority, a clearer decision-making boundary, better measures, a scheduled review? Just write down what you think is missing. And then this week, fix it. Don't simply hand the task back again without building the ownership around it, because the question isn't who can I give this to? The better question is, how do I make it possible for someone else to own this task? And that's where delegation really, really begins to work. Now, if you're listening to this and recognizing that there's still far too much that's coming back to you, it would be useful for you and I to have a conversation, because sometimes the difficulty isn't knowing what to delegate first. Sometimes it's knowing who could take it on. But often, because the business becomes so dependent on you, it's difficult to see where to begin. And that's exactly the kind of thing we can explore together. We'll look at where your time's going now, what keeps coming back to you, and what are the biggest leverage points for you in your business. And what could change for you if responsibility was structured slightly differently. It's no complicated process. It's just an honest conversation about where you are now and how your business can become less dependent on you. Now, if you'd like that conversation, just send me a message or follow the link in the comments. I'll just put it in there, by the way. And we can arrange a time. Okay. Thank you for joining me today. And remember, delegation isn't about giving away tasks. It's about developing people who can own the outcomes, because the goal isn't simply to have less to do. The goal is to build a business where everything no longer has to come back to you, the leader. So I will see you again. Same time, same place next week. I've just noticed a comment there from Charles. I'm really glad you're finding it interesting. And in the meantime, you go and have a really fun and profitable week. Thank you for joining me.